James, on today's show, we are interviewing Phil the Thrill Kerpen, last name Kerpen. This guy breaks down the stats related to COVID-19 on a daily basis in a way that melts my face.
He knows the facts.
He knows the facts. He focuses on the facts and not the fear, which is why his Twitter feed is followed by Dan Bongino, Liz Wheeler, Buck Sexton, Monica Crowley, Alex Brinson, Dinesh D'Souza, Alan West, General Flynn, Sarah Gonzalez, Donald Trump Jr., Brett Baer, Jim Jordan, and Dr. Jim Meehan. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce to you the great Phil Kerpen.
Get ready to enter the Primetime Show.
Started from the bottom, now we here. Started from the bottom, and we'll show you how to get it. Started from the bottom, now we here. Started from the bottom, now we here.
We started from the bottom, now we're on the top, teaching you the systems to get what we got. Colin Dixon's on the hooks, I break down the books. Z's bringing some wisdom and the good looks. As the father of five, that's why I'm alive. So if you see my wife and kids, please tell them hi. It's the C&Z up on your radio, and now 3, 2, 1, here we go.
We started from the bottom, now we here. Started from the bottom, and we'll
Yes, 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 and yes. Thrive Nation, on today's show, it is a very special occasion. I could not be more fired up for this guest, and I would guess that the vast majority of the listeners don't know who our guest is, but I do, and that's all that matters to me. Phil the Thrill Kerpen, welcome on to the Thrive Time Show. How are you, sir?
I'm good. You got me pumped with the Drake there. Very nice,
Brother. Let me tell you, I listen to Dan Bongino. This is kind of my blend I do. Okay, I like to listen to a little bit of Joe Rogan, a little bit of Dan Bongino, read a little bit of Ephesians, go to a little bit of Guts Church in Tulsa. I kind of have an information intake process I do. And on my daily journey of gathering facts, I go to your Twitter feed, Phil Kerpen, and up there, I'm going to read your most recent tweet because it is you every time you blow my mind, and it's almost too good. It's too good because we're in this world where the media just puts out misinformation constantly. So let's look at your most recent tweets here. You are, okay, you're retweeting here, Cuomo, New York Post, where it says, Cuomo blames GOP, New York Post, for controversy over nursing home COVID-19 deaths. Phil, why did you retweet this particular post?
Well, there was a comment on top of that from a doctor in Ohio named Pradeep Shankar, who wrote, "What a disingenuous prick. This is 100% gaslighting." And, in this particular case, he commented on Cuomo better than I could, so I retweeted that rather than putting my own comment on this latest absurd denialism from Cuomo, who is responsible for, along with Murphy in New Jersey, the worst COVID catastrophe in the entire planet, direct consequence of their disastrous policy of sending highly infectious patients into nursing homes where we had highly vulnerable populations, and they got these sky-high death totals. And, of course, Cuomo refused to even tell us how many nursing home residents died. They say we just can't possibly count them until maybe after the election. And so they're still stonewalling. They're still denying. They're not cooperating with federal investigators. They're not cooperating with legislative oversight in Albany. And when he gets pressed on it, he says, "Oh, it's this is a right-wing New York Post thing. They're out to get me."
Your pinned tweet right now says, check out answers to anti-schoolers on Mass General Korea, Israel, Chicago, and Georgia. What's that tweet all about?
They're like a handful of canards that the anti-school advocates come back to over and over and over again. They really have very little to work with because every single day we get more and more evidence that schools are a very low-risk setting, that children are at no risk themselves and very seldom transmit the coronavirus. And we've got so much empirical evidence of this now from country after country after country, and now state after state in the U.S. that have been open for months in many cases. And yet there are these handful of studies. There was one from Mass General that had a fake press release that said children are silent spreaders, and then we actually got them to retract the press release and correct it because the study itself didn't match that. There was the fake study from South Korea, the government report that the New York Times hyped as claiming that children age 11 to 20 were highly infectious, and then, of course, the data actually showed the opposite, that 97% of households with virus in adult brought it in, and the other 2% 2-point-something% were shared exposures between adult and child, where you couldn't actually determine who brought it into the household. But the New York Times hyped this to scare everyone. That was one of the big things that scared a lot of schools into closing. And then the anti-school writer from the New York Times actually tweeted that she didn't want to jinx it, but she thinks the tide has turned against schools. And so that was a big one. And then, Israel opened schools the same time they opened weddings and other mass events, and they had the Shavuos holiday, and then they had this increase in cases. And of course, it wasn't the schools that caused it. It was all those other things, especially when you compare to literally every other country in the world, that schools weren't the cause. But people love to point to Israel, that one exception. And then we had a Chicago study that was children under age 5 who were highly symptomatic. They found to have high viral loads in their noses. That has obviously nothing to do with schools because, number one, the children were under age 5, which means they were not school age, and number two, they were highly symptomatic. And you're not going to send a highly symptomatic child to school. And then there was the Georgia camp study, which proved absolutely nothing because it was at peak transmission in the state, and they didn't determine who infected whom, and so that certainly didn't prove that children were transmitting. So I sort of collected the explanations and responses to those 5 most popular anti-school canards, and I put them in a document, and it's been pinned for a couple of months because the anti-school arguments really haven't changed much in the last couple of months. All the actual evidence coming in that schools are very, very low-risk settings and certainly should be open.
Phil, Dinesh D'Souza, Dan Bongino, these guys follow you on Twitter. Monica Crowley follows you on Twitter. Alan West follows you on Twitter. General Flynn follows you on Twitter. Liz Wheeler follows you on Twitter. Buck Sexton follows you on Twitter. Dan Bongino mentions you on his show frequently. Sarah Gonzalez with the Blaze Network follows you on Twitter. Ted Cruz, Senator Ted Cruz follows you on Twitter. So many people are following you on Twitter. Where are you from? I mean, what's your background? It seems
I got to get that little summary transcribed and put on a brag sheet somewhere. I didn't even know most of that. That's pretty awesome.
It is.
I run a free market advocacy group in D.C. called American Commitment. If people want to check it out, it's americancommitment.org. And we sort of focus on the fiscal, economic, and regulatory issues that are kind of on the margin. That could go either way, where a little bit of citizen engagement and involvement can make a difference. And we ask people to write letters to Congress or regulatory agencies or the White House and try to tip some of these fights in a more free market direction. But honestly, for the last 6 months plus, what has there been to work on other than trying to stop the shutdowns and the lockdowns and everything else relative to COVID, because everything else has been sort of eclipsed and sidelined. And so I've been pretty singularly focused on that as opposed to kind of all the usual taxes and spending and healthcare and energy and technology policy stuff that I would be working on. And then the other hat that I wear is I also work for the Committee to Unleash Prosperity that was founded by Steve Moore and Art Laffer and Larry Kudlow and Steve Forbes. And, of course, Larry Kudlow is now disembarked for the White House, and so he's no longer affiliated with it. But with that group, we do a daily newsletter with sort of, if you like the tweets, you should definitely get on the newsletter. And it's John Fund from National Review writes a lot of the newsletter, and then Steve Moore and I add items and edit it and that kind of thing, and we send that out every morning. And if people want to get on that, it's free, committeetounleashprosperity.com.
I mean, you are providing such data in this time of misinformation. And what I wanted to do, if I could, is I brought on my good friend James, who's actually from Manhattan. The attorney, James, meet Phil the Thrill Kerpen.
Hi, Phil. Nice to meet you. My name is James DeCristofaro.
He's an attorney. And Phil...
my wife's an attorney, so I don't mind them.
Well, he moved here from Manhattan. He moved to Oklahoma from Manhattan. Is that correct, James? To escape the craziness, the lockdowns.
That's right.
And you're aware of the data, but I'm going to start... If I can, I'm going to try to fly through some big ideas. And Phil, maybe you can help me sort this out. Initially, we were told that we needed to shut down America, lock it down, shutter the schools, stop the spread for 2 weeks to pause, because 2.2 million people might die from COVID-19 in these great United States. The models were created by the Abdul Latif Jameel Institute. The director of that organization was Neil Ferguson. And by the way, Neil Ferguson and the Abdul Latif Jameel Institute happen to be funded by Amazon. A little fun fact, Phil, if you look that up, that's a lot of fun. So then it turns out the models were wrong. Phil, what do you think about the Abdul Latif Jameel Institute and Neil Ferguson somehow having the power to tell every American to shut down their business and their economies. What do you think about those nefarious models?
Well, it's pretty remarkable because Neil Ferguson has predicted 15 of the last one global pandemics. I mean, this guy, every single time there's a disease on the horizon, he says it's going to be a catastrophe. He said the mad cow disease was going to be a catastrophe, and he said bird flu and swine flu were going to kill, millions or hundreds of millions of people all over the world. And he has one mode where, you ask him about any given pathogen, and he says this is going to be catastrophic and kill millions. And he says it over and over and over again. And usually he's ignored. But this time, for some reason, he was listened to, and in both the United Kingdom and the United States, he was really sort of the key input that sparked, massive lockdowns, which were only now partially extricated from many months later. And to me, the most remarkable thing about this is that he himself didn't seem to believe the assumptions of his own model, because after having tested positive for coronavirus, he violated his quarantine to liaise with a married woman that he's been seeing. And, you got to kind of wonder, how seriously can he take his own model and, the supposed great risks involved
he had
with
a
this
fever.
virus if he himself, after having tested positive, violates the quarantine.
Phil, listen here. He had a fever, and the only cure is typically cowbell, but he didn't have a cowbell available, so he needed to go have some sex. That's what he was trying to do. He was trying to get some sexual healing. He was listening to Marvin Gaye. You can't hate on him for being a hypocritical, affair-mongering guy, can you, Phil? I mean, Phil, can you really judge a man for being a nefarious hypocrite? Phil, this seems pretty harsh.
Well, I mean, my judgment is not so much that he engaged in that behavior, and that was his assessment of the risks. My judgment is more that he supports government policies restricting everyone else's choices on the basis of risk that he himself does not take very seriously.
Phil, not that you need a hype man, but let me tell you this real quick. Donald Trump Jr. follows you on Twitter. General Flynn, as I mentioned, follows you. Jim Jordan follows you. Brett Baer follows you. Tom Fitton follows you. The Daily Caller follows you. My good friend Dr. Jim Meehan follows you. So apparently you know what you're talking about. Is it shocking to you that the models were wrong? Now we move on to these PCR tests. And the United States military came out and said, oops, we need to let you guys know we falsely said 600,000 people had COVID-19. You see all of these local counties, you see local cities, states, one by one saying, oops, we found out the tests were wrong. Is it shocking to you that we've now moved the goalposts to focus on, instead of deaths and the hospitalizations that would overwhelm the hospitals, now we're focused on cases as a country? Has that shocked you at all?
Well, I think it's very foolish, and it's rather remarkable that one of the only countries that doesn't do that does not consider you a case unless you're actually sick, is China, where their definition since, I think, late May or early June of a case has required meeting the symptomatic definition, not just having a positive on the test. And I think they're sort of laughing at the rest of the world, their economic rivals, imposing, severe economic restrictions and deprivations and limitations of civil and human rights on the basis of really questionable test results. And in this country, in the U.S., we haven't even done any what are called external quality assessments, which is when you send known samples that are positive or negative or have a different virus to labs and then determine how often that lab gets it wrong. We haven't done that. So we don't know what the error rates are of these labs on these tests. But if you look at sort of the analysis that's been done in other countries, there was one recently, an external quality assessment in Germany, that found a 1.1% false positive rate. Now, depending on where you live in the United States, that might be all your positives, 1.1 or less. And it is, most days here in D.C. we're under that number. And so it's very possible that all or nearly all of the positives in some places in this country are false positives. There may be no actual prevalence at all, no disease burden at all, and yet we have these ongoing restrictions and policies based on these test results of a test that was never designed for that purpose of population surveillance and has not been validated. And we don't know what the error rates are, which is pretty astonishing. And then, the other factor on top of that, Clay, is even the so-called true positives might not be live virus. They might be a shadow of an old infection that could be up to 3 months old, according to the CDC. Most people are only infectious for 7 days after symptom onset, but they can continue to have enough dead virus in their body to show positive on a PCR test for up to 12 weeks. And the New York Times in late August ran a story where they were able to get data from 3 states, Nevada, New York, and Massachusetts, and they found that 85 to 90% of the so-called cases in those states, the positive test results, had too little virus to actually be infectious. And so they were actually capturing old infections, and the number of presently infectious people being found by those tests was only about 10% of the reported case numbers. And then remarkably, the very next day, New York Times went back to hyping the case numbers as if they had never reported that, and so did the rest of the country. And so I think we're doing everyone a huge, huge disservice by obsessing about numbers that don't necessarily mean what people have been led to believe they mean and are nonetheless being used to justify sort of ongoing restrictions.
You know, Dr. and Senator Rand Paul recently stated, he says, I'm quoting, he says, if you look at under age 18, the mortality rate from COVID-19 is about 1 in a million. If you look at age 18 to 45, the mortality rate is about 10 in 100,000. Above that, it increases, but interestingly, it is still pretty small. And the vast majority, even people up to 65 years of age, it may well be between 95 and 99% have a very mild case of this COVID-19. So I'm not saying it's a benign disease. People do get sick, and some even die from this. But your chances are good. We shouldn't live in fear forever. And then Dr. Scott Atlas from Stanford was recently appointed to be the newest member of the White House Coronavirus Task Force. And so at his first briefing, he's wearing a purple tie. And this is what he had to say.
We know that the risk of the disease is extremely low for children, even less than that of seasonal flu.
So if what Dr. Scott Atlas is saying is true, and if what Dr. and Senator Rand Paul is true, and it is true based upon the facts, then Dr. Fauci has to be either dishonest or extremely wrong, or there's something going on there. And then President Trump recently tweeted out today, commenting on Dr. Fauci, who says that he was taken out of context for a recent Trump commercial. He has stated, and I'm reading from Donald Trump's Twitter account directly. Donald J. Trump tweeted, President Trump tweeted 7 hours ago. He says, actually, Tony's pitching arm is far more accurate than his prognostications. No problem, no masks. Who no longer likes lockdowns? Just came out against it. Trump was right. We saved 2 million USA lives. What do you think about this? Should we be trusting Dr. Atlas or Dr. Fauci? I want to get your take on this.
Well, I think that that Fauci testimony with Dr. Rand Paul was, either shockingly ignorant or brazenly dishonest. And, people can use their own minds to determine which one it was. But, he was stating things that were plainly false and that he knew was false. For instance, he said, no one believes what you believe, that there's meaningful T-cell immunity. He said something, pretty close paraphrase, to Senator Paul. And he himself said in August that T-cells were a 1-2 punch with antibodies, and NIAID, his agency's research that they funded, showed that there was a robust T-cell response. And so the guy was contradicting his own past statements, things that he knows very well as an immunologist. And, I don't know why. I don't know why we've seen such bizarre flips and flops and misstatements from Fauci. Of course, this is the same guy, as Dr. Atlas also pointed out, Fauci's the same guy who told us, don't use masks, they're ineffective, and then changed to use masks all the time, they're great, and then changed to maybe everyone should wear goggles. So he's really been all over the map. And to your point, we know who's at risk. Those are the CDC numbers. The survival rate for under age 20 is 99.997%. It is far higher than seasonal flu. Seasonal flu, according to the CDC, is 5 to 10 times more dangerous for children and people under age 20. Survival rate for under age 50 is 99.98 for age 20 to 50. Pretty comparable to flu. And, it doesn't really start to increase dramatically until above age 70 and people who are very medically frail. And that's where you've got very, very serious danger with this. And I think the point that the Trump administration has finally come around to, and I wish they would have been here 6 months ago, but, better late than never, is, look, if you're under age 70 and you're not medically frail, then you should be able to go to work, go to school, live your life pretty normally.
Amen.
With the exception that when you're going to have interactions with people who are very old or medically frail, you need to take appropriate precautions. And that means that you need to avoid coming in close contact with them, or you need to test before you do. And, I think that getting these instant tests out is going to make it much easier to have those interactions between, everyone else and the people who are at high risk, and to be able to do a rapid test, get the results, and then be able to go in and visit, and a medically frail relative in a nursing home or something like that without great risk, or even out in the community. The one thing I'd really like to see that they still haven't done is I'd really like to see the FDA approve the instant tests for home use. If we could get these tests, Abbott has them for $5. There are other manufacturers that say they can get them as low as $1 or $2.
Yep.
If we could get those for home use, and you could just go pick up a 10-pack at the drugstore and use them when you want to, then you'd really be able to implement the president's strategy much better, because when you're not going to be in contact with anyone medically frail, you can live your life as normal. But if you're going to visit an elderly parent or grandparent,
there you
or
go.
somebody who's, you could just take the test at home for your whole family and then go. And so I would really like to see the FDA approve those for home use. So far, they've only approved them for clinical lab tech to administer, and maybe in an institutional setting you can have a lab tech on hand almost all the time to do it. But it would be much more useful if they would approve them for home use. So I'm hoping that'll happen.
This just in, folks. If the elderly people with comorbidities decided to quarantine themselves, and then you and I went around and lived our normal lives, as long as we didn't visit the people that were at risk, they probably wouldn't get it if they chose to quarantine. I mean, Phil, are you following my logic? Does that make a lot of sense, that if people who are at risk decided to quarantine and we all decided to not visit them unless we had been tested first, we couldn't spread it to them? Doesn't that make a lot of sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. And frankly, if we had sort of a strategy that centered around the idea of limiting exposure for the people who are at risk, I think that we could make it much easier and more tolerable for them as well, not just for the low-risk people who be able to get life back to normal, but for the high-risk people who, instead of being subject to sort of this blunt lockdown measure, and we've got a lot of people in nursing homes who haven't been able to see family for 6 months plus.
Unbelievable.
Now. It would be much, much better if you were able to test, show the thing on your phone showing I tested negative today, and then they let you in, or however that works, or have the test on site, or however that works, but, be able to use our technology, use our resources to protect people, and still allow them to interact and to have that support. Because one of the factors that hasn't been as well reported as probably should be is we've seen this huge increase in dementia deaths. We've seen this huge increase in non-COVID deaths among elderly people, just from lack of contact with family, lack of support. That has a real impact. There was a study actually that just came out on this. I think it's from the United Kingdom, that lockdown caused a 53% increase in mortality, non-COVID mortality among seniors.
I've got a little fun fact here.
That was with dementia, seniors with dementia. And so, that support from family is important. So I think, look, we need to get to exactly where Scott Atlas has been saying, which is if you're low risk, you should be able to go to work, go to school as normal. We've got huge resources now in terms of testing, PPE, all the rest of the stuff. Use it so that we can have safe interactions between low risk and high risk. Focus our resources and our efforts there. We'd save a lot more lives and we'd cause a lot less damage.
Phil, I'm going to read you a story that I never thought I would be reading to you on a podcast, but I need to read this little story to you. Let me get my little story music here real quick. This is from Newsweek. Let me get my music queued up here. Okay, here we go. This is from Newsweek. The article's titled, Dr. Fauci backed the controversial Wuhan lab with U.S. dollars for risky coronavirus research. And the article reads, Dr. Anthony Fauci is an advisor to the President Donald J. Trump and something of an American folk hero for his steady, calm leadership during the pandemic crisis. At least one poll showed that Americans trust Dr. Fauci more than President Trump on handling the coronavirus pandemic. And few scientists are portrayed on TV by Brad Pitt. But just last year, the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the organization led by Dr. Fauci, funded scientists at the Wuhan Institute for Virology and other institutions for work on gain-of-function research. Phil, you know this. Gain-of-function research has been very controversial because it could cause a pandemic. And just for people out there that don't know what gain-of-function research is, it's where you manipulate a naturally occurring virus and you mix that with human tissue. And I'm reading here directly from Newsweek. It reads, many scientists have criticized gain-of-function research, which involves manipulating viruses in the lab to explore their potential for infecting humans because it creates a risk of starting a pandemic from accidental release. I don't think the average person knows that Dr. Fauci funded the controversial Wuhan lab with U.S. dollars for the risky coronavirus research. Do you think the average person knows that?
Well, I've certainly seen it a lot of the places that I read, but the average person probably not, because I haven't seen it on any of the network news or anything like that. So, people see the stories that are presented to them, and the role that he played in supporting the lab that this more than likely originated in has not been, I don't think he's really been pressed on that point. So, no, I think most people don't know that.
I just think it's so bizarre that the guy who funded there's a lot of laboratories in the world. The guy who funded the specific laboratory where the virus came from is now advising us on what to do with the virus. It's unbelievable. It's truly, the conflicts of interest are amazing there. Phil, do you have a rap song introduction? Has anyone ever made you a rap song introduction?
I don't think so.
I'm going to do it for you, and I'm going to give it to you, and you're not going to want it. I'm going to give it to you, and if you love it, it's great. And I know you don't want it, and I know you're not asking for it, but this is going to be like when someone gives you a gift that you don't want, this is probably how it's going to go over, or you might love it, but I'm giving you your own Phil the Thrill rap song because you deserve it. You can't put out that level of tweets and accurate information without having your own rap song. So I'm just telling you in advance, it's coming to your email. Get ready.
Love it. Love it. Thank
Okay.
you.
Now, Phil, my final two questions for you. Dr. Richard Bartlett is the former top medical advisor for the governor of Texas. He's a guy you might want to interview or a guy you might want to research. But Dr. Richard Bartlett, he's a former top advisor again for Governor Perry of Texas for 7 years. He has now successfully treated over 1,000 COVID-19 patients with 0 fatalities using budesonide and a Z-Pak. He's got all of his information documented at budesonideworks.com. He's been on One American News and Newsmax. Is it shocking to you that when somebody has treated 1,000 people successfully with no deaths, that it goes completely unreported by the mainstream media?
It's really interesting because the idea of using inhaled steroids, and that's not the only one that's been used. There's another inhaled steroid called cyclosonide that's been used very successfully in Japan and Korea, although I don't know anyone who's used it in the U.S. That one's Alvesco. The one that you're talking about is marketed as Pulmicort. The idea of using an inhaled steroid was really disparaged early by the World Health Organization when they were saying, don't ever use steroids. Steroids are bad. Steroids are horrible. And I think that the really bad results we got early on in places like New York and New Jersey were largely a consequence of doctors listening to the World Health Organization instead of listening to their own experience. And their own experience would say, if you've got people with a viral pneumonia or people who are short of breath, having trouble breathing, one of the most logical things to use is an inhaled steroid. And in fact, they were also avoiding systemic steroids at that time, and now they're using them quite a lot, giving people shots of, dexamethasone or methylprednisolone or that kind of thing, and they're getting very good results with the systemic steroids as well. And so I am a little bit surprised, given that the World Health don't use steroids advice was totally wrong, and we've now moved really far from that in terms of systemic steroids being widely used. I'm surprised that we haven't seen inhaled steroids tried very much, even though we have these successes, these ones in Texas, and successes with a similar inhaled steroid, as I said, in Korea and Japan. And so I don't know the answer to that. There are a few clinical trials that are going on right now. I know there's one in Buffalo, New York, where they're using steroid inhalers. They're having EMTs give them to people sort of on their calls, and there's a randomized controlled trial to see whether that's helpful. And so I hope that we'll have good data. There are a couple of trials that were run months ago in Korea and Japan on Alvesco inhalers, and they still haven't read out, to my knowledge, which is a little bit annoying. So I think that it's just one of these unfortunate things where the message went out early from World Health Organization, avoid steroids, and it's just been very slow for doctors to try things that are contrary to that very bad early advice, and they seem to have gotten there on using systemic steroids, and unfortunately they're maybe not quite there yet on the inhaled steroids, even though there is a lot of promising evidence. And I hope that we'll get a readout from one of these clinical trials soon, and if it does work, we'll know with some good evidence.
Phil, final question here for you. You've got the ear of the Thrive Nation. I believe what I'm reading as I look through your Twitter feed is that we should be focusing on the facts and not this overhyped media fear. But what is the message you're trying to communicate out to the world? Who if you could just say maybe one message, or what would you say to the Thrive Nation?
Well, I think that the number one thing is that kids should be in school. I think it's so disgusting that we've imposed such severe hardship on the least among us, children, who are also the basically least vulnerable to this disease. As we mentioned, seasonal flu is 5 to 10 times more dangerous for children than coronavirus is. That's according to the CDC. And yet, many of them are still not in school at all, or only in school a couple of days a week, and they're being masked all day, and they're being treated like, there's some sort of infectious agent, even though children almost never infect adults. And frankly, even if children did infect adults, I think it would be, even if children were highly infectious, I think it would be immoral to impose hardship on them for the benefit of others, for a disease that doesn't negatively affect them. And so I think we've got to do much, much better by our kids. And then the second thing I would say is that, we can't run and hide and be scared of a virus. We've got to be able to live our lives and do things and have our economy running and operating, and at the same time, do what we can to protect the vulnerable. And I think that if we focus our efforts and our resources on that, we can actually do a much better job of saving lives than these indiscriminate measures, which have basically been ineffective.
Folks, that's Phil Kerpen. You can check him out on Twitter. That's PhilKerpen. Phil Kerpen, you are an amazing American, a statistician, a fact-based, logic-using guy who really stands alone in many ways in this world where we have this mainstream media hyped fear. It's just everywhere. I appreciate you for extinguishing the flames of fear with truth on a daily basis, man. And I really do appreciate everything you're doing to help give people some facts. And just thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Take care. And now, without any further ado, 3, 2, 1, boom!